So apparently, according to Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity, the church does not want the details about the Book of Abraham getting out there. But I must admit, hiding the details from your members by posting the details right there on your official public website is a pretty bold move. And I hope Cameron does realize that literally all of the original source documents he uses in this video are from the church-sponsored and directed Joseph Smith Papers project. He literally is using the sources the church gave him and then implies they are hiding this. Awkward. Cameron even made a thumbnail with my face on it, called me out on Facebook, and implied that I was avoiding addressing the points in his video. So I offered to do a public debate with him on the subject, but Cameron said no. Now, to be fair, Cameron is new to the LDS apologetics world, so he may not be aware that every claim in his video has been talked about ad nauseum by just about every LDS apologetics channel for the last decade, including multiple scholarly journals and ones that are not by LDS scholars. The bottom line is that the stuff he brings up in this video is very old news. Now, I must admit, Cameron's channel is actually a favorite of mine. I like Cameron, and the production value on this video is A+. The creepy music? Well done. But what about the arguments? Well, let's get into his main points.
Because the biggest bombshell came in the 1960s when the original papyri were rediscovered. For the first time in over a century, modern Egyptologists could directly study the exact scrolls from which Joseph claimed to have translated the Book of Abraham. And surprise, surprise, every expert determined that these were not Abraham's writings at all.
Surely this is the end. Well, that is, unless the fragments he's talking about are not actually the source of the Book of Abraham. Apparently, Cameron just assumed the papyri we have today is all of the papyri Joseph Smith had. Apparently, he forgot to do even a basic Wikipedia search.
After Smith's death, the papyri passed through several hands. They were presumed to have reached a museum in Chicago and subsequently destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire. However, not all of the fragments were burned, and some were eventually acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1947.
That's right. We absolutely do not have all of the papyri that Joseph Smith had. And a look at the historical record will show that Joseph had both a collection of papyri fragments and long scrolls. Now, just take a look. Do those look like fragments or long rolled up scrolls?
You got me.
But let's go on.
Two principal theories emerged to reconcile the facts. Number one, the missing scroll theory. And number two, the catalyst theory. We're going to see how the Mormon Church officially responded to this in a minute, but let's first debunk each of these theories in turn and explain why they both collapse under the weight of Joseph Smith's own writings. Now first, the missing scroll theory suggests that the actual text containing Abraham's story was on another portion of the papyrus that's now lost. Since the rediscovered fragments don't mention Abraham, proponents claim Joseph Smith must have worked from a different section, one we simply don't have today. On the surface, this might sound somewhat plausible, at least to some people.
Well, yeah, because unless you can show that we for sure have all the papyri and none were lost in the fire, then there must be some missing scrolls.
But here's the catch. Joseph Smith's own notebooks, sometimes called the Egyptian alphabet and grammar, include images of the exact Egyptian characters that correspond directly to the published verses of the Book of Abraham.
Uh-oh.
We can literally see the hieroglyphs on one side and the Egyptian translation on the other, detailing Abraham's story.
Yeah, this seems pretty damning until you realize the document on the screen literally does not contain the text from the Book of Abraham. Look closely. The document you are looking at is part of a project to discover some sort of original human language by the amateur linguist W. Phelps. Well before Joseph even acquired the papyri, Phelps was attempting decodings like this of other ancient documents. Does this look familiar? So while there is debate over these documents, it seems pretty obvious that Phelps was working with Joseph to reverse engineer the text that Joseph had received by revelation to try and create something like their own personal Rosetta Stone.
That makes sense.
Again, just look at the document. This is not the Book of Abraham manuscript. If Cameron knew better, he would have put this image on the screen, which does show the text of the Book of Abraham next to hieroglyphs from the papyri. But is this Joseph Smith's handwriting?
Nope.
But can you guess whose handwriting it is? You guessed it, our linguist friend W. Phelps. And this document is not an original. In other words, it seems Phelps is again copying Joseph's original revelation and seeking to connect it with his alphabet. The manuscripts show a secular attempt at decoding the papyri. And while Joseph may have been supportive of Phelps' project and even involved to some degree, Joseph's translations were always given through revelation and not by some secular attempt at decoding. Until Cameron can account for W. Phelps' ongoing linguistic projects and the fact that we don't have all the papyri, he can't simply write off the missing scroll theory. But on to number 2.
The second theory is what many modern Mormons lean on, the catalyst theory. It proposes that Joseph Smith wasn't doing a literal translation from Egyptian. Instead, he was simply inspired by the papyri or used them as a kind of divine prompt to receive new revelation. The Book of Abraham then is said to be scripture in a spiritual sense, regardless of what the scrolls literally say. But here's the problem with this, at least one of the problems. Joseph Smith himself consistently called this work a translation. In the original 1842 publication in Times and Seasons, he literally titled it, quote, "a translation of some ancient records," purporting to be the writings of Abraham.
I'm a little confused here. Joseph only spoke English. He never even claimed he was translating in a traditional sense. For instance, Joseph said he translated a lost parchment of John, which Joseph never even claimed to have. More properly, one can say that Joseph was rendering text by revelation to give a functional rendering of ancient works.
If this was purely catalytic, then why take the trouble to copy each hieroglyph and produce an Egyptian alphabet and grammar?
Exactly. Do you see how this works? Joseph would not need to produce an alphabet and grammar to translate, but the amateur linguist, W. Phelps, would.
So when you hear modern Mormon apologists mention the missing scroll or a catalyst, remember we have Joseph Smith's notebooks.
No, we have W. Phelps notebooks,
in which he literally calls it a translation.
A translation through revelation. Look, Cameron is new here, so I get it. And I am not an expert myself on the Book of Abraham. It's a complex topic, and aspects of the Book of Abraham can cause doubt. But if you're going to explore the Book of Abraham fairly, you can't just focus on the evidence against it. You have to also consider the evidence for it. You see, people like Cameron don't want to talk about all aspects of the Book of Abraham. They are very selective in what they want to talk about. Now, why is that? Well, maybe it's because if you actually get into the text itself, you find all sorts of things critics cannot account for. Things that Joseph Smith had no way of knowing. Daniel Peterson, a professor of Near Eastern languages and culture, lays it out nicely.
Joseph Smith produced the Book of Abraham. The Book of Abraham clearly seems to reach back into ancient materials regarding its hero and his environment, to which Joseph Smith could not have gained access through natural means. Within its brief text, for instance, the book tells us that Abraham's own fathers had turned aside from worship of the true God to the service of the god of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. The Bible, on the other hand, appears to know nothing about the idolatry of Abraham's ancestors. However, their polytheism, along with Abraham's conversion to the worship of the true God and his attempt to convert his family, is a common theme of many very old Jewish stories. The book of Abraham refers to a place that it calls the plain of Olishem. No such place name occurs in the Bible, but it does occur in an inscription of the Akkadian ruler Naram-Sin, dating to about 2250 BC, the approximate time of Abraham. It refers to a place located in northwestern Syria, in the area near Amman and Ebla. It also appears in a list of cities under the reign of Sesostris III, who ruled between 1873 and 1854 BC, where it's 2 towns north of Ebla. The idolatrous worship of the gods of Elkanah, Libnah, Mamakra, and Korash that's described in the book of Abraham also seems to be identifiable in the ancient world, despite the fact that the Bible makes no mention of them. Indeed, Elkanah, Libnah, and Korash are all known from inscriptions dating to roughly Abraham's time and place. Furthermore, although the average person would never have thought of it, the ensemble of 4 figures depicted at figure 6 of facsimile 2 does indeed represent this earth in its 4 quarters, just as the book of Abraham says. So too, figure 11 of facsimile 1 is, says the explanation given by the book of Abraham, designed to represent the pillars of heaven as understood by the Egyptians. And in fact, the phrase pillars of heaven does occur in Egyptian literature, and the forms in facsimile 1 are evidently the characteristic lintel and post pattern familiar from the architecture of early temple complexes, such as that at Saqqara. Furthermore, the identification of the angled lines below the lion couch in facsimile 1 as the firmament over our heads must seem rather strange to any modern reader. It only makes sense when we realize that the lines represent the waves of the water in which the crocodile is swimming, and that the ancient Egyptians conceived of heaven as a heavenly ocean. One noteworthy element of the religious situation portrayed in the book of Abraham is the identification of a crocodile as the idolatrous god of Pharaoh. What ill-educated 19th century American, seeing a crocodile lurking underneath the lion couch in facsimile number 1, would ever have thought of such an identification? Yet the book of Abraham is precisely correct on this point. Unas, for example, was the last king of the 5th dynasty around 2300 BC, and his pyramid still stands at Saqqara, south of modern Cairo. Utterance 317 of the Unas pyramid texts includes the following: "The king appears as the crocodile god Sobek. Unas has come today from the overflowing flood. Unas is Sobek, green-plumed, wakeful, alert. Unas arises as Sobek, son of Neith." Speaking of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, during which the traditional dating of Abraham places his lifetime, one scholar observes that the god Sobek is viewed as a manifestation of Horus, the god most closely identified with the kingship of Egypt. Intriguingly, Middle Kingdom Egypt, around the time of the 12th dynasty, the most likely time of Abraham's own life, saw a great deal of activity in the large oasis to the southwest of modern Cairo, known as the Fayum. Crocodiles were common there, and Sobek was the chief local deity. The last king of the 12th dynasty even adopted the name of the crocodile god, calling himself Nefru Sobek, and 5 pharaohs of the 13th dynasty took the name Sebek Hotep. The book of Abraham tells of an attempted sacrifice of the patriarch. The Bible knows nothing of such an episode, but post-biblical literature repeatedly mentions Abraham's miraculous deliverance from an attempt to kill him. And now the name of Abraham has actually been found in a 3rd century AD Egyptian papyrus associated with a lion couch scene, much like that in facsimile 1. Unsurprisingly, Abraham leaves the land of Ur not long after his miraculous escape from death and goes to Canaan. When the autobiographical portion of the book of Abraham ends, we find him about to enter the land of Egypt. There, in order to preserve his life, the Lord advises him to conceal the fact that Sarai is his wife, and instead to tell the Egyptians that she is his sister. The Bible records the story of Abraham's lie, but is silent regarding the divine counsel that authorized it. However, the Genesis Apocryphon, a document found among the famous Dead Sea Scrolls only in the mid-20th century, agrees with the book of Abraham that the patriarch's behavior in this matter was divinely ordained. And there was good reason. The crocodile king of Utterance 317 in the Unas pyramid texts, which I've already cited, is portrayed as willful and tyrannical. Specifically, he's said to steal wives from their husbands whenever it suits him to do so. That is, of course, exactly what Abraham expected Pharaoh to do to Sarai. The 3rd chapter of the book of Abraham offers a remarkable picture of what might be termed Abrahamic astronomy. The prophet is shown various features of the heavens, including even the great astronomical body Kolob, which is set nigh unto the throne of God. Recent research indicates that the astronomical model portrayed here fits very well among ancient geocentric or earth-centered notions. It's interesting to note that although nothing in the Genesis account of Abraham's life suggests that he had any special astronomical interests or knowledge, many post-biblical texts preserve an image of him that accords perfectly with that in the book of Abraham. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus, for instance, knows of earlier records that portray Abraham as a man righteous and great and skillful in the celestial science. In the Testament of Abraham, which dates to the 1st or 2nd century A.D., the patriarch is caught up into heaven and given a spectacular view of the earth and all its inhabitants. Both the Book of Jubilees, composed in the 2nd century BC, and the 7th century AD Muslim Quran portray Abraham as a meditative contemplator of the skies. The 1st to 2nd century AD Apocalypse of Abraham tells how the patriarch was taken into heaven, where, among other things, he beheld hosts of stars and the orders they were commanded to carry out, and the elements of earth obeying them. The 10th century Muslim scholar at-Tabari, widely regarded as the greatest of medieval commentators on the Quran because, among other things, of his careful gathering up of earlier materials, knows of a vision in which the 7 heavens were opened up to Abraham, up to and including the throne. According to the book of Abraham, the Lord wanted the patriarch to transmit the astronomical and theological information he'd received to the Egyptians. I show these things unto thee before ye go into Egypt, that ye may declare all these words. And in fact, although the text of the book of Abraham, as we currently possess it, doesn't actually carry the story into Egypt, he seems to have fulfilled his divine assignment. Facsimile 3 shows an Egyptian scene in which Abraham is reasoning upon the principles of astronomy in the king's court. Josephus, too, knows of Abraham's going into Egypt to teach astronomy, and the great church historian Eusebius of Caesarea, who lived in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, preserves an even earlier account in his Praeparatio Evangelica that has Abraham going to Egypt, and there teaching astronomy or astrology to both the priests of Heliopolis and to Pharaoh himself. The pagan astronomers Firmicus Maternus and Vettius Valens preserve quotations of astronomical material attributed to Abraham. The 4th and 5th chapters of the book of Abraham record a vision of the creation received by the prophet that parallels the account given in Genesis, but also differs from it in certain important ways. Here, too, the account of Abraham preserved in the Pearl of Great Price goes beyond that in the Bible, but receives support from sources that Joseph Smith is unlikely to have known. At-Tabari preserves reports that Abraham was granted a vision of the creation. One of the interesting elements of the creation account given in Abraham 4 through 5 is its use of the verb to organize, by which we're given to understand that the gods formed the heavens and the earth out of pre-existing materials. Now, this flies in the face of centuries of Christian tradition, which have insisted that God created the universe ex nihilo, that is, from nothing. Once again, however, the book of Abraham finds support in current scholarship. The doctrine of ex nihilo creation simply cannot be found in Genesis or anywhere else in the Old Testament. Ancient Jewish writings claim that God created the universe by giving form to formless matter. It's not until the 2nd century after Christ that Christian thinkers began, under the influence of Greek philosophy, to teach creation from nothing, and the doctrine gained wider acceptance only gradually thereafter.
Now, Dr. Peterson is only one of many scholars who have pointed out the incredible correspondences in the text that Joseph rendered. So how should we summarize this? Maybe the best way would be to do a little thought experiment. Would it be reasonable to believe that Cameron, with all his current knowledge, could produce something like what Joseph produced? Here is what he would have to do. In a mere 7 pages, he would have to include all of the following. First, a story about Abraham's near-human sacrifice by Egyptian priests that not only shows up in undiscovered ancient apocryphal works, but also is confirmed as consistent with human sacrifice practices at the time of Abraham. Second, he needs to include a story about a pharaoh seeking to take Abraham's wife, only to have that later confirmed by archaeology as a practice of the pharaoh during Abraham's time. Third, he must produce a story about Abraham being an astronomer who teaches the Egyptians about the stars, only later to have a variety of ancient documents about Abraham telling the same story, including mentions of it by people like Josephus. Fourth, In addition to the previous stories, he also needs to include one about the idolatry of Abraham's father, and then have that show up in undiscovered ancient Hebrew stories about Abraham. And then that also needs to align with later archaeological work that shows that this perfectly aligns with the religious culture and circumstances of Abraham's time period. Fifth, in this story, Cameron will need to invent names of places. Maybe one, let's call it Olishem. And that place not only needs to be linguistically consistent with the ancient language of that time, it also needs to end up actually being found. Not only that, but this place, Olishem, needs to be found in records from the time period of Abraham in the location where modern scholars show Abraham likely lived. Sixth, Cameron needs to come up with multiple other names off the top of his head for gods, names like Shinha or Elkanah, only later to have those random names be shown to have a deep connection to Canaanite deities from the time and place of Abraham. And seventh, as he's going along with all those other elements, in these 7 pages, he also needs to posit a creation account that flies entirely in the face of his family and community's religious tradition by rejecting creation out of nothing, only later to have scholars confirm that in Abraham's day, the belief was in creation out of pre-existing material, not creation out of nothing. Also, just for a bonus, in these 7 pages, including all of the stuff previously mentioned, Cameron also needs to create a theological model that is consistent with an entirely novel plan of salvation and incorporate notions such as pre-existence, human agency, intelligences, and complex cosmological models that imply time and space are interconnected. Now, I could include even more things that Cameron would have to include, but with just this, I don't think it's reasonable to believe that Cameron, even with all his education, could produce a 7-page text with all of those remarkable correspondences. So that's why I also don't think it's reasonable to believe that Joseph could. But we're not done yet. You see, we may not have the source text for the Book of Abraham, but in the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists discovered portions of the long-lost Book of Enoch in places like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Joseph claimed to have translated or rendered a prophecy of Enoch. So does his translation match the newly discovered documents? Well, a non-Mormon expert on the Book of Enoch named Cirillo Salvatore decided to examine Joseph Smith's rendering of the Book of Enoch, and what he found shocked him. But stick around, because we'll get into that in my next video.
Hey guys, the video you just watched is the most up-to-date version of this video. I actually made this updated version because I made a mistake in the previous version of this video. In the first version of this video, I actually was mistaken in a comment that I made about Joseph Smith's handwriting being found on this document. As I pointed out in the video you just saw, Joseph did assist in Phelps' reverse engineering project, but there is no indication Joseph's rendering of the Book of Abraham was the product of Phelps' secular linguistic project to use the papyri to decode the original human language. Anyway, I just want to be sure that I'm transparent with anyone who saw the previous version of this video and correct the record. I hope you'll accept my apology for that error, and I hope you enjoyed this more up-to-date version of the video.